Middle-earth has survived things that should have ended it. The fall of Numenor, the forging of the One Ring, the long shadow of Morgoth stretching across an entire age of the world, the armies of Sauron pressing against the last alliance of men and elves until the alliance nearly ceased to exist. It is a world that has been to the edge more times than its historians can comfortably count, and has always barely pulled back from it, always at enormous cost, always through the specific combination of courage and sacrifice, and the intervention of forces older and more powerful than anything walking its surface. It is a world that understands darkness and understands the price of resisting it, and has built its entire mythology around that understanding. And then one morning, in a field outside the Shire, something arrives that this world has no mythology for: a bald man in a yellow suit who has no magic, no destiny, no ancient power, and no upper limit. And the darkness that Middle-earth has spent 3 ages fearing does not survive the afternoon. What you are about to hear is the complete story of what happens when the most unstoppable force in anime lands in the most carefully constructed dark fantasy world ever written, and the darkness loses before it even understands what hit it. Every part of this story escalates in a direction you will not see coming, so stay for all of it. Hit like right now. Subscribe if you are new, and do not skip a single part because the best moments are not where you expect them to be. The Shire is, by the deliberate and careful design of the world that contains it, the most insulated place in Middle-earth from the large and terrible things that happen in Middle-earth on a semi-regular basis. This is not an accident, and it is not simply geography, though the geography helps: the rolling green hills and the comfortable distances from Mordor and Isengard, and every other location where darkness tends to concentrate and organize itself, are part of it. But the deeper insulation is cultural, almost philosophical, the result of a people who have collectively and across many generations made the decision that the large things happening elsewhere are elsewhere things, and therefore not their concern, and who have sustained this decision with such consistency and such genuine conviction that the Shire has developed a kind of ambient normalcy that persists even when the rest of the world is in various states of crisis. Hobbits are not brave in the conventional sense, and they are not powerful in any sense, and they are not particularly interested in becoming either of those things. And the specific result of this is that the Shire is a place where the most dramatic events tend to be arguments about fence lines and competitions at the Harvest Festival, and the occasional scandal about someone having had second breakfast at an irregular hour. And this is, for the hobbits who live there, exactly how things should be. It is into this specific, carefully maintained, philosophically committed normalcy that Saitama falls from the sky on a Tuesday morning in what the Shire calendar would call the 3rd week of Afterlife, landing in a field of barley belonging to one Homan Greenhand of Hobbiton with a sound and a physical consequence that the Shire has no prior experience with and no framework for categorizing. The sound is the sound of something very large moving through air very fast, and then stopping very suddenly, which produces a compression wave that travels outward from the point of impact and rattles every window in Hobbiton simultaneously, and causes 17 hobbits to spill their tea in the same moment, which is the kind of synchronized misfortune that the Shire has never collectively experienced before, and which produces, in the immediate aftermath, a silence of approximately 4 seconds while everyone processes what just happened, followed by the sound of 17 separate small voices asking some version of the question of what in the name of the Shire was that. The crater in Homan Greenhand's barley field is clean and circular, and about 10 meters across, which is large by Shire standards and incomprehensible by the standards of what anyone in the Shire has ever seen a falling thing produce. And at the center of it, standing in a posture of complete physical comfort, is a short man with no hair wearing a yellow garment of a style that no tailor in the Shire or anywhere in Middle-earth has ever produced. Looking around at the green hills, and the hobbit holes built into them, and the morning sky above with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected, and is taking a moment to assess whether it is going to be a problem. The first hobbit to approach the crater is Samwise Gamgee, which is simultaneously surprising and completely in character, because Sam is the specific kind of person who approaches things that other people are cautiously not approaching, not because he is reckless, but because his fundamental orientation toward the world is one of engaged curiosity wrapped in practical concern, the orientation of someone who wants to know what something is so that he can figure out what to do about it. And the something in the crater is close enough to his garden that he feels a proprietary responsibility toward whatever consequences it might have for the surrounding soil quality. He reaches the edge of the crater and looks down at the man in the yellow suit, and the man in the yellow suit looks up at him. And Sam, who has seen a Balrog and a giant spider and the Eye of Sauron and the armies of Mordor, and has processed all of those experiences without losing the essential Samishness of his perspective, responds to the bald man in his neighbor's barley field with the question that any sensible hobbit would lead with, which is whether the gentleman is all right and whether he needs anything. Perhaps a cup of tea. Saitama says that tea would be fine, thanks, and climbs out of the crater with the ease of someone stepping over a low fence. And Sam leads him back toward Bag End because Bag End is where you take unexpected visitors in Hobbiton. It has always been where you take unexpected visitors. And Frodo is home, and Frodo has had enough experience with unexpected visitors and unexpected situations that he will know what to do with this one. Or at least know how to ask the right questions to figure out what to do with it. Frodo opens the door to find Sam on the step with a bald man of roughly human proportions, but not quite human bearing, the proportions being close enough to a man's that the differences are subtle. The specific quality of stillness in the body, the eyes that are present without being searching, the absence of any of the small physical tells that people have when they are in an unfamiliar place and are navigating the social landscape of it. The slight wariness or the performed confidence or the careful attention to how they are being received. This man has none of those tells. He is simply standing on the step the way a stone stands in a field, completely and uncomplicatedly present without any of the social machinery that presence normally comes packaged with. And Frodo, who has spent enough time around extraordinary beings to have developed a sensitivity to the specific quality of what extraordinary feels like in a person's presence, reaches out with that sensitivity now and gets back something that he cannot interpret. Not because it is too large for him to interpret, the way Gandalf's presence was too large and Galadriel's presence was too large, and the Nazgul's presence was too large in the opposite direction, but because it does not participate in the dimension he is reaching along, does not register as light or dark or powerful or humble, or any of the qualities that the spiritual texture of Middle-earth assigns to the things that move through it. He invites him in for Elevenses, because it is nearly Elevenses time, and the Shire's answer to anything that does not immediately make sense is to offer it food and see if that helps clarify the situation. Saitama sits at the table in Bag End and eats several portions of the food that Sam produces with the focused appreciation of someone who genuinely enjoys food and has a caloric requirement that most kitchens are not prepared to meet. And between portions, he answers the questions that Frodo asks with the honest directness that is his only communication style, explaining that he is a hero from somewhere else, that he arrived here by accident through a mechanism he does not fully understand, that he has no particular agenda in this world and no particular plan for returning to his own, and that in the absence of a specific reason to go anywhere or do anything, he will probably just walk around and see what there is and help with anything that needs helping with if he comes across it. He says this last part not as an offer of extraordinary capability, but as a description of default behavior, the way a plumber might mention in passing that if you ever have a pipe problem they are happy to take a look. And Frodo, listening to this, has the specific experience of someone receiving information that is larger than its delivery suggests, the experience of a sentence that sounds like one thing and means another thing entirely. He asks carefully, what kind of things Saitama usually helps with. Saitama thinks about this for a moment and then describes, with the flat accuracy he brings to self-description, a career of dealing with monsters and disasters and beings who threaten cities and populations, delivered in a tone of mild retrospective boredom that would seem like false modesty if the flatness of it were not so obviously genuine. And Frodo listens to this account and Gandalf's voice appears in his memory, unbidden, saying something about the strange paths that Providence takes and how the most important arrivals are often the ones that look least important at first. And Frodo decides, on the basis of this memory and the evidence of the man sitting at his table, eating his second plate of second breakfast with no visible sign of stopping, that whatever this is, it is probably going to matter in a way that neither of them can fully predict from this table in this hobbit hole on this ordinary afterlife morning. What neither of them knows yet, but what Sauron's eye will discover within the next 48 hours and respond to with the specific alarm of an intelligence that has been monitoring Middle-earth for centuries and has never before encountered something it cannot see, is that the bald man eating second breakfast at Bag End is the first thing to appear in Middle-earth in the entirety of the Third Age that the eye cannot find, cannot locate, cannot fix its attention upon. And the reason the eye cannot find him is the same reason Sam's tea did not affect him and home in Greenhand's barley field now has a crater in it, which is that Saitama does not participate in the spiritual and metaphysical architecture of Middle-earth in any way that architecture has sensors for, does not carry the ring of power, or the absence of a ring of power or any darkness, or any light, or any of the qualities that the eye was built to detect, and is therefore, from the perspective of the most comprehensive surveillance system the world of Middle-earth has ever contained, simply not there. And the thing that Sauron does not know, that his eye cannot tell him because his eye cannot see it, is that the thing that is not there just finished its third plate of food and is asking Sam if there is any more of that potato dish because it was particularly good. The eye of Sauron is not a metaphor. This is a point that the people of Middle-earth who have stood close enough to feel it understand in their bones and in the specific quality of the fear it produces, which is not the ordinary fear of a dangerous thing nearby, but the particular and more complete fear of being known, of having every hidden thing in you suddenly visible to something that is looking for exactly those hidden things and knows precisely what to do with them once found. It is a will made into a gaze, the concentrated essence of Sauron's consciousness extended outward across the whole of Middle-earth in a continuous sweeping surveillance that has no true blind spots and no true rest, that moves across the world the way a lighthouse beam moves across water, methodically, relentlessly, returning to every point on its circuit with the patience of something that has been doing this for so long that patience is no longer even the right word for it. Having become instead simply the texture of how it operates, every creature of darkness reports to it, every ring of power resonates with it. Every act of significant magic disturbs the fabric of the world, in ways that it reads the way a spider reads vibrations in its web, not through effort, but through the simple fact of being connected to everything that matters, of having spent so many centuries weaving itself into the underlying structure of Middle-earth's metaphysical reality, that the distinction between the eye and the world it watches has become genuinely difficult to locate. It felt Saitama's arrival, not in the way it feels the arrival of things it can identify and categorize, the flare of elvish power, the resonance of Númenorian blood, the dark signature of a Nazgul moving through the world on its master's errand, but as an absence, which is something the eye has almost no experience of, because the eye's experience is built entirely on the principle that everything that is real in Middle-earth is also present to it in some form, that reality and visibility are the same thing from the eye's perspective, that if something is happening in the world, then the world will tell the eye about it because the eye is woven into the world, and the world does not keep secrets from itself. The crater in Homan Greenhand's barley field was a real event with real physical consequences: disturbed earth, shattered crop, a compression wave that rattled windows across Hobbiton. And the eye felt all of those consequences the way it feels everything, as information propagating through the fabric of the world it monitors. But the cause of those consequences was not there. The eye swept to the Shire immediately, the way it sweeps toward any significant disturbance, and found the disturbance but not the source, found the hole but not the thing that made it, found every ripple of the stone's entry into the water and no stone. This has not happened before. The Nazgul are dispatched within hours, not because Sauron has identified a threat. He cannot identify something he cannot see, but because the absence of identification where identification should be possible is itself a threat, the specific threat of something that his comprehensive awareness cannot account for, and the Nazgul are his most reliable instrument for investigating things that his eye cannot resolve from a distance. They move toward the Shire with the speed that the Nazgul move toward things their master directs them toward, which is the speed of absolute obedience combined with the specific physical capabilities of beings who have been stretched beyond death into a form of existence that is mostly will and very little body. And they ride through the night with the cold certainty of things that have never failed to find what they were sent to find. Because the Nazgul's method of finding is not based on the same metaphysical framework as the eye's surveillance. It is based on the resonance of the One Ring, on the call of darkness to darkness, on the specific attunement to fear that makes them effective against anything that can feel fear, which in Middle-earth is essentially everything. They arrive at the borders of the Shire at midnight and spread out along the perimeter in the coordinated way that 9 minds sharing one master's direction spread out, and they reach inward with the cold sense that is their primary instrument, the sense that does not work through light or sound or smell, but through the specific spiritual frequency of the ring's call, the frequency that every living thing in Middle-earth that has been touched by the ring's influence responds to whether it wants to or not. And the response of the Shire to their presence is the normal response. The hobbits in their holes feel the cold without knowing what the cold is, pull their covers tighter, have unpleasant dreams that they will not remember in the morning. And the small animals of the fields go quiet in the specific way that small animals go quiet when something that is not a predator in any natural sense passes through their territory. Something that triggers the alarm systems of the nervous system, without fitting any of the categories those alarm systems were designed for. Saitama is sleeping in Frodo's guest room because Frodo offered, and the offer seemed sensible given that he had nowhere else to be. And the bed was reported to be comfortable, which it is, by the standards of what comfortable means to a body that does not experience discomfort in any conventional sense, but still has preferences about horizontal surfaces. He is sleeping in the specific way he sleeps, which is completely, without the vigilance that most people who have spent years fighting things that want to kill them develop as a baseline state of being, the alertness that never fully turns off because experience has taught it that fully turning off is a vulnerability. Saitama has no such vigilance because Saitama has no vulnerability that vigilance would protect, and so he sleeps with the unguarded totality of someone who has never needed to be afraid of what might come through the door while he is unconscious, and the Nazgul's cold presence extending through the Shire toward the location where he sleeps reaches him and finds him and produces in him no response at all, no dream fear, no tightening of the body. No subtle awakening of the part of the nervous system that monitors threats during sleep, because that part of his nervous system has nothing to monitor and has been effectively retired. The Nazgul Lord, the Witch King of Angmar, who leads the 9, and whose experience of hunting things across Middle-earth spans more centuries than most kingdoms have existed, has never in that long experience found something by following the ring's call and arrived at a location, and found that the location contained nothing the call could attach to. He arrives at the road outside Bag End, and extends the full force of his perception toward the building and finds the hobbits inside. Frodo's presence vivid and close because of his long proximity to the ring even after its destruction. Sam's presence warm and solid and uncomplicated. The elderly Mr. Bilbo's presence in his room like a candle that has burned a long time and is nearing its end. And he finds nothing else. No presence of darkness. No presence of significant power. No presence of anything that should have produced the disturbance his master sent him to investigate. Just the ordinary presences of ordinary beings sleeping through a Shire night. He circles the building. He extends his perception to its maximum range, which is considerable, the range of a being that has been hunting this particular sense for millennia. He feels the world around Bag End in complete detail, the worms in the soil, the moths around the distant lanterns, the foxes at the edge of the fields, the snoring of approximately 40 hobbits in the surrounding area. And at the center of all this detailed, complete living world information is a room in Bag End that contains a bed and something sleeping in the bed that his perception cannot find, cannot describe, cannot attach any quality to, not darkness or light, not power or weakness. Not life in the way Middle-earth defines life or death in any of the forms Middle-earth has given him direct experience with, just an absence in the shape of a person, a silhouette cut out of the fabric of perceivable reality and left empty. He sends this report to his master, because the Nazgul Lord is not capable of independent decision-making on the level that this situation seems to require. His centuries of service have refined him into an instrument of absolute precision within the parameters his master established, but have left him genuinely without resources for situations outside those parameters. And Sauron receives the report and does something that Sauron almost never does, which is pause before responding. Because the report describes something that his accumulated knowledge of Middle-earth, which is more comprehensive than any library in Gondor or Rivendell or Lothlorien, does not contain a category for. He knows what things can hide from the eye. Elvish cloaks of a specific making can obscure movement but not presence. Certain ancient magics can mute a signature but not erase it. Tom Bombadil exists entirely outside his reach. But Tom Bombadil has been there since before Sauron's earliest memory, and his absence from perception is the absence of something that was always absent, a known unknown, a stable anomaly that has never moved from its boundaries in the old forest and has never shown any disposition to do so. What the Nazgul Lord is describing is something different from all of these, not something hidden, not something muted, not a known anomaly, but something that was not there before and is there now and produces physical evidence of its presence, but cannot be found by any of the methods that have found everything else he has ever looked for. He directs the Nazgul Lord to remain and observe, and he turns the full force of his attention toward the Shire for the first time in this age, the eye sweeping everything aside and focusing with a concentration that dims his awareness of the rest of Middle-earth temporarily. The way a person doing something that requires all their focus lets peripheral awareness lapse, and he looks at the Shire and at Bag End, and at the specific room in Bag End, where his most experienced servant reports finding nothing. And he looks with everything he has, every layer of the perception he has spent 3 ages building, every thread of the web he has woven through the world's spiritual fabric, every instrument of detection that his vast and ancient intelligence has developed or acquired or discovered across the whole of his existence. He finds nothing. Not the nothing of something successfully hidden. The nothing of something that is genuinely not there in the sense his perception uses the word there, which is to say not present in the metaphysical fabric of Middle-earth in any way that the fabric has sensors for. Not woven into the world's spiritual reality in any of the ways that everything which exists in Middle-earth is woven into it, not accessible through any of the threads that lead back to everything else. Because those threads require a point of attachment, and this thing provides no point of attachment, exists in physical space without existing in the relational space that his entire perception is built to navigate. It is not invisible. It is not hidden. It is simply not a thing that his world was built to see, and his world is the instrument he is using, and the instrument cannot measure what it was not designed to measure. The Witch King is still outside Bag End when Saitama wakes up slightly before dawn in the way he wakes up, which is immediately and completely, sitting up from horizontal to vertical in a single motion, and spending the next few seconds doing the internal inventory of what kind of day it appears to be, which in this case is a day in an unfamiliar place with no particular agenda, which is a category of day he is fairly comfortable with. He becomes aware of the cold outside the window, not because the cold affects him, but because it is present in the way that a change in the weather is present, noticeable without being relevant, and he gets up and goes to the window and looks out and sees the Witch King of Angmar standing in the road, black-robed and mounted and radiating the cold presence of 9 dead kings given over to a dark will. Looking at Bag End with the full attention of a being whose entire existence has been devoted to finding things and bringing them to its master. Saitama looks at him for a moment. He notes the black robe, the absence of visible face, the general aesthetic of something that is meant to be terrifying, and that in any other context with any other person at the window would be succeeding at this completely. He notes that it is very early and that he has not had breakfast yet, and that there is something standing in the road that is probably not there for a friendly reason. And he makes the assessment that he always makes in these situations, which takes approximately 2 seconds, and arrives at the conclusion that this is probably something he should go deal with. Because there are hobbits in this house, and the hobbits cannot deal with it themselves. And dealing with things the hobbits cannot deal with themselves is precisely the kind of thing a hero is for. He goes downstairs. He goes out the front door. He walks down the path to the gate and opens the gate and walks out into the road and looks at the Witch King of Angmar from a distance of about 10 meters, and the Witch King looks back at him, or directs its attention toward him, which in the absence of visible eyes is the functional equivalent of looking. And for a moment the road is completely quiet in the way that roads become completely quiet when something that is not ordinary is happening in them. Saitama says good morning. The Witch King does not respond to good morning, because it does not have the framework for responding to good morning in this context, because nothing in its centuries of existence as the Lord of the Nazgul has prepared it for the specific situation of having gone to investigate an anomaly, and having the anomaly come out and greet it. And in the absence of a prepared response, it does what the Nazgul do when they encounter something that needs to be brought to submission, which is project the full force of the terror that is their primary weapon, the Black Breath, the overwhelming emanation of dread and despair that has driven armies from battlefields and broken the will of men who have faced dragons without flinching, the terror that reaches into the part of every living thing that knows it will one day die and grabs that knowledge and holds it up close and says soon, and now, and there is nothing you can do. Saitama stands in it and feels nothing, and the nothing he feels is not courage. Courage is what you have when you feel the fear and move toward it anyway, and there is no fear to be courageous against, because the Black Breath requires a fear of death as its operating surface, and Saitama's relationship with his own death is something he stopped examining a long time ago, because it stopped being a useful thing to examine. The way you stop checking whether a lock is locked, once you have confirmed enough times that it does not lock. He asks the Witch King if it is going to move, or if he should go around. And the Witch King of Angmar, who has not experienced surprise in any meaningful sense since the fall of Arnor, experiences something in this moment that is the closest thing to surprise that its current form of existence permits, which is a complete failure of its primary tactical instrument to produce any of the results it always produces, combined with the deeply disorienting experience of being asked a navigational question by the thing it came to investigate, and it draws its blade. The Morgul blade that it used on Frodo Baggins on Weathertop, and that carries in its steel the specific dark enchantment of a wound that would drag a victim toward the shadow world, and it raises it, And what happens next is very fast and involves Saitama's fist and a road that will need significant repair, and a Nazgul that is no longer in the physical vicinity, and Sauron, whose full attention is still focused on the Shire, feels through the web of his connection to his servants the specific and unmistakable sensation of one of his nine simply stopping, the thread that connected him to the Witch King of Angmar going slack, and then going away. Not severed the way a thread is severed by a blade, not fraying the way a thread frays from stress, but removed in the specific and total way that a thread is removed when the thing it was connected to no longer exists in any form that threads can connect to. He had 8 Nazgul remaining. And somewhere in the Shire, a bald man in a yellow suit was going back inside to see if breakfast was ready, because it was getting light and he had been awake for at least 10 minutes, and the situation seemed to be resolved, and breakfast was the next logical priority. The news of what happened on the road outside Bag End reaches Rivendell before Frodo's letter does, carried by the specific channels through which significant information travels in Middle-earth when the people responsible for monitoring significant information are doing their jobs, which in this case means Gandalf, who has a sensitivity to disturbances in the world's fabric that functions as an early warning system of considerable range, and whose response to the early warning he received from the direction of the Shire was to get on his horse and start moving before he had fully articulated to himself what the warning was about. He arrives at Bag End 3 days after the road incident to find the Witch King's blade lying in pieces on the ground outside the gate, not shattered in the way blades shatter from impact, which produces irregular fragments with stress fractures visible along the break lines, but separated into sections with the specific clean geometry of something that was divided by a force so complete and so fast that the blade had no opportunity to respond to the stress before it was already over. And Saitama sitting on the front step, eating an apple and watching a caterpillar make its way across the garden path, with the patient, mildly interested attention he brings to small things in quiet moments. Gandalf looks at the blade fragments. He looks at Saitama. He looks at the blade fragments again with the specific quality of attention he brings to things that require more than a single look to understand, reaching outward with the perception that his long existence and his status as one of the Maiar has given him, the perception that moves along different axes from normal elvish or human sensing, and that has, over the course of his time in Middle-earth, given him an accurate reading of almost everything he has pointed it at. What it gives him now is the same nothing that the Eye of Sauron found and the Witch King found before the Witch King stopped existing, the same complete absence of spiritual signature, of metaphysical presence, of any quality that his perception uses to describe and categorize the things it encounters. And unlike the Eye and unlike the Witch King, Gandalf's response to this nothing is not alarm, and not the aggressive projection of force, but a long, considering silence followed by sitting down on the garden wall and asking Saitama, in the conversational tone of someone opening a dialogue they intend to pursue carefully, whether he would like to tell an old man where he came from and what he is. Saitama gives him the same account he gave Frodo, the same honest and unornamented description of a different world and a training regimen and a career as a hero and an accidental arrival. And Gandalf listens to it the way Gandalf listens to things that matter, which is completely and without any of the expressions or interjections that signal active listening in normal conversation, just absolute attention. The full engagement of a mind that has been gathering and processing information for longer than most of Middle-earth's current geography has existed in its present form. When Saitama finishes, Gandalf is quiet for a moment, and then he asks one follow-up question, which is about the training, specifically about what the training was and what it produced. And Saitama explains the push-ups and the sit-ups and the squats and the running and the no days off for 3 years and the hair and the limiter. And Gandalf listens to this with an expression that moves through several stages, from careful attention to something more active that is not quite disbelief, but is the adjustment process of a very sophisticated understanding encountering information that does not fit its current architecture and beginning the work of expanding to accommodate it. He says, after a longer silence than the first one, that he has in his long experience encountered many kinds of power. The power of the valor, ancient and shaped by the intent of the world's creator. The power of the rings, concentrated and corrupted and costly. The power of bloodlines and traditions and the slow accumulation of wisdom across generations. But that he has not encountered before the specific thing that Saitama is describing, which is power that arrived not through gift or corruption or inheritance, but through the simple and total removal of the boundary that keeps power from growing past a certain point, and that the implications of this removal, as he understands them from Saitama's account, are that the ceiling Saitama operates beneath is not a fixed thing but an adaptive one, not a wall but an absence of wall, and that the distinction between a very high wall and no wall at all is not a distinction of degree but of kind. And he says this not with alarm, but with the careful intellectual honesty of a being who has spent his existence trying to understand the world accurately, and who takes genuine pleasure in receiving information that makes his understanding more accurate even when the information is challenging. Saitama listens to this and says, "Yeah, that's pretty much it." The council at Rivendell, which convenes within the week because Gandalf sends word to Elrond and Elrond sends word to everyone else with the urgency that significant new information warrants, is a different council from the one that formed around the question of the One Ring, different in tone, and in the nature of the problem it is trying to address, and in the degree of agreement about what should be done that exists among its members at the outset. The Ring Council was a council of people who agreed that the ring was a problem but disagreed about how to address it, and required a process of argument and revelation before arriving at a decision. This council is a council of people who have been given the same basic information about Saitama, and who are each processing it through their own framework of understanding and arriving at responses that reflect their frameworks clearly enough to be instructive about the frameworks themselves. Elrond, who has lived through the Second Age and the Third, and who carries in his memory the direct experience of every significant event in Middle-earth's history, since before most of the people at the table were born, receives the information with the careful neutrality of a being whose long experience has taught him that things which appear unprecedented are usually unprecedented only in the sense that this particular combination of elements has not appeared before. While the elements themselves are individually recognizable, and he begins almost immediately trying to locate Saitama within the categories he has available, asking questions about the nature of the training and the mechanism of the limiter, and whether there are others of his kind, and the answers he receives gradually construct in him a picture that he holds with more uncertainty than he normally holds pictures. The uncertainty of a very knowledgeable person encountering the edge of their knowledge and being honest about where the edge is. Aragorn, who is at the council as the heir of Isildur, and as a man whose entire adult life has been preparation for a destiny larger than himself, looks at Saitama with the assessing attention of an experienced ranger evaluating a potential ally, reading his posture and his demeanor and the quality of his attention, and the specific absence of the performed qualities that people bring to councils of this kind, the performed gravity, the performed awareness of stakes, the performed identity of someone who knows they are in a room where important things are being decided. Saitama has none of that performance, sits in his chair with the same quality of presence he brought to Frodo's kitchen table, and Aragorn reads this absence of performance not as ignorance of the situation's stakes, but as something more interesting, which is a person for whom the stakes of situations do not modify the texture of how they sit in chairs, because the stakes of situations are not the organizing principle of their experience of being in them. Legolas is watching Saitama with the elvish attention to physical detail that notices things human perception tends to miss. And what he is noticing is the quality of stillness in the body, the specific economy of movement of someone whose body has been so thoroughly refined by the training he described that it no longer moves except with purpose. No fidgeting, no unconscious adjustment, no of the small physical negotiations that human and elven bodies conduct constantly with their environment. And this quality of stillness registers to Legolas's elvish perception not as the stillness of rest, but as the stillness of something fully present and fully capable, and simply not currently engaged, the stillness of a strung bow rather than an unstrung one. Gimli is the most straightforward member of the council in his response, which is to say, he wants to know what the man can do, and whether it can be directed toward Mordor, and how soon they can arrange for it to be directed toward Mordor. Because Gimli's relationship with strategic complexity has always been shorter than his relationship with tactical directness, and the tactical directness of the situation seems to him obvious enough that the strategic complexity around it should not take very long. Gandalf, who has been listening to the council's responses with the specific quality of attention he brings to gatherings where he needs to understand not just the content of what is being said, but the map of what each person's response reveals about what they are capable of understanding and what they are not, eventually says what he has been building toward since his conversation with Saitama on Frodo's front step, which is that the question this council should be asking is not what Saitama can do for their situation, but what their situation means in the context of his presence, because those are different questions, and the second one is more important. He says that the situation in Middle-earth, the ongoing threat of Sauron, the question of the ring, the alignments of races and kingdoms, and the long geopolitical consequences of decisions made in ages past, is a situation that was organized around a specific distribution of power, and that every strategy available to every party in the situation is built on assumptions about that distribution. And that Saitama's presence changes the distribution in a way that makes every existing strategy need reassessment, not because he is simply a powerful new piece on the board, but because he is a piece that does not follow the rules the board was built for, and whose presence therefore changes what the board is. Saitama, who has been listening to this with his elbows on the table and his chin resting on his hands in the posture of someone following a conversation that is mostly about them with the mild, unconcerned attention of someone watching a documentary about an animal they have never seen before, says that he does not really understand most of what they are discussing, but that if there is something dark and threatening somewhere that needs to be dealt with, he is happy to go deal with it, and that they should probably tell him where it is and approximately what it looks like, so he does not accidentally punch the wrong thing. The silence that follows this is different from the silences that have followed previous things Saitama has said in this story, because those silences were the silences of people processing complexity, and this silence is the silence of people who have just watched a problem that they have been organizing their entire strategic reality around be reduced, in one sentence, to a question of directions and description. And the reduction is so complete and so sudden that the first response is not relief and not celebration, but the specific vertiginous feeling of a weight being removed from your back, so quickly that your body, which had adjusted its entire posture to carrying the weight, does not immediately know what to do with the absence of it. Gandalf is the first to recover, because Gandalf's recovery time from unexpected information is shorter than almost anyone else's due to a life spent specifically in the practice of receiving unexpected information and responding to it usefully. And he says that the dark thing Saitama is describing is called Sauron, and that it is located primarily in a place called Mordor, and that its physical manifestation is not straightforward in the way that the physical manifestations of things that can be punched tend to be straightforward, and that this is a conversation they are going to need to have in some depth before anyone goes anywhere. And he says this in the tone of someone who is genuinely trying to be helpful and accurate rather than building suspense. Because Gandalf knows the difference between information that needs to be complicated and information that someone is complicating unnecessarily. And this particular information genuinely needs to be complicated because Sauron's current physical situation is genuinely complicated in ways that matter. Saitama says okay and sits back in his chair and gives Gandalf the full and patient attention of someone who is prepared to listen for as long as the listening is useful. And Frodo, watching from his place at the table, has the experience he has had several times since the bald man showed up at Bag End of feeling that the shape of the story he has been living in has changed. That the narrative arc of the long struggle against the shadow that has defined his life since the ring first came to him has bent in a new direction, not the direction he expected or planned for, or was prepared for by all the long preparation that Gandalf and Bilbo and his own hard experience had given him, but a direction that has the specific and unmistakable quality of the direction things bend when something genuinely new has entered them. When the story has received a piece it did not know it was missing and has begun, without anyone consciously directing it to, rearranging itself around that piece to find the shape it was always going to be once the piece arrived. The explanation of Sauron's current physical situation takes the better part of an afternoon, which is not because the situation is impossible to explain, but because the situation requires the kind of careful, layered explanation that Gandalf brings to things that are genuinely complicated. The kind of explanation that builds its foundation before placing anything on top of it, that establishes the context before introducing the content, that respects the intelligence of its audience enough to give them the full architecture, rather than just the conclusion. He explains the One Ring and the distribution of Sauron's power into it, and the consequences of that distribution for Sauron's current state, which is to say the state of a will of enormous ancient power that has been temporarily severed from the physical vessel it built for itself, and is in the process of reconstituting that vessel through the slow recollection of dispersed power, a process that requires time and the ring's continued existence, and the absence of any force capable of interrupting it. He explains that in the current moment Sauron does not have a body in the way that things which can be punched have bodies, that what exists in Barad-dûr is closer to a concentrated will than a physical presence, a point of enormous dark intention that has the practical effects of a body. It can direct, it can command, it can project the eye without being a body in the technical sense. And that the ring is the mechanism through which the body is being rebuilt, and is therefore the mechanism through which the whole situation can be resolved permanently, which is why destroying the ring is the strategy the Fellowship was organized around. Saitama listens to all of this with the genuine attention he promised, and at the end of it asks the question that cuts directly through everything that has just been explained to the thing underneath it, which is whether the ring can be destroyed by punching it. And the Council's response to this question is the response of a group of people who have spent so long inside a very complicated problem that a very simple question about it lands with the specific force of something that should have been asked much earlier and wasn't. And Elrond says, after a moment, that the ring cannot be destroyed by conventional force, that it was made in the fires of Mount Doom and can only be unmade there. And then he pauses because he is already following the implication of Saitama's question to its next step, which is whether Saitama's force is conventional in any sense that this constraint applies to. And the pause extends because the honest answer to that secondary question is that they do not know. Gandalf says that they genuinely do not know, and he says this with the intellectual honesty that makes him trustworthy in a way that more confident advisors are not. The honesty of someone who knows the difference between what is established and what is assumed and refuses to present assumptions as establishments, even when the assumptions are very old and very widely held. He says that the constraint on the ring's destruction has always been understood in the context of the forces available in Middle-earth, which are the forces of men and elves and dwarves and the Maiar and the Shadow, all of which exist within the same metaphysical framework as the ring itself and are therefore subject to the same rules, and that Saitama's force, based on everything they have been able to observe and assess, does not exist within that framework, and therefore the question of whether the framework's rules apply to it is genuinely open. He says it with the specific quality of honesty that costs something, the honesty of a being who has organized a significant portion of his long efforts around a particular understanding of the problem, and is now acknowledging that the understanding might be incomplete, and the cost of it is visible in the care with which he says it. Saitama picks up the cup of tea that has been sitting in front of him throughout the council and drinks from it, and then sets it down, and says that he is happy to go to Mount Doom and try, and that if punching does not work he will figure out something else, and that either way it seems like going to Mordor is probably the next thing that needs to happen, and they should probably start moving because sitting in councils does not usually resolve things in his experience. It usually just uses up time that could be spent moving toward wherever the problem is. He says this not impatiently, but with the practical directness of someone whose experience of solving problems has been almost entirely kinetic rather than deliberative, whose entire methodology is based on the principle that the most efficient path between the current situation and the resolved situation is a straight line with a punch at the end of it, and that deliberation is useful for planning the path, but at some point the planning is done and the moving should begin. Aragorn looks at him for a moment and then looks at Gandalf, and Gandalf looks back at Aragorn, and there is a moment of the specific communication that happens between people who are each independently arriving at the same conclusion and are confirming it with eye contact before voicing it, and the conclusion is that Saitama is right and that they should go, that the council has given him the information he needs, and the information has not produced any reason not to go, and several reasons to go immediately rather than after additional deliberation. Frodo says that he wants to come, because Frodo has been on this road longer than anyone at the table, and cannot imagine stepping off it at this point, even though the nature of the road has changed so completely from what it was when he stepped onto it, that it barely resembles its original form. And no one argues with him because no one at the table has the standing to tell Frodo Baggins he cannot walk toward Mordor when he has already walked toward Mordor once before and arrived. And besides, his presence matters in ways that go beyond the practical. The presence of the person who carried the ring as a reminder of what the whole thing was actually about, and what the cost of it had been, and what it would continue to cost if the source of the cost was not addressed. They leave Rivendell the following morning, and the journey to Mordor is different from the Fellowship's original journey in almost every way that journeys can be different while still covering the same approximate geography. The original journey was haunted by pursuit, by the constant awareness of the Nine and of Sauron's attention sweeping toward them, and the desperate necessity of staying ahead of that attention long enough to reach the destination. The journey of people who were outmatched by their enemies and knew it, and were running on courage and hope, and the specific stubbornness of people who have decided to do a thing regardless of the odds against it. This journey has none of that texture. The 8 remaining Nazgul that Sauron dispatches to intercept them encounter Saitama at the border of Rohan, and what follows takes less time than the description of it requires, because 8 Nazgul moving with the coordinated purpose of 8 aspects of the same masters is still 8 things that need to be dealt with one at a time or several at a time, and Saitama's approach to multiple opponents has always been the approach of efficiency rather than elegance. The minimum number of actions required to produce the maximum number of resolved situations, and the minimum number of actions required here turns out to be very small, and the time required to perform them turns out to be shorter than the time it takes Legolas to reach for his bow in response to the threat. Gandalf watches the Nazgul stop existing in rapid succession, and his expression holds something more complex than relief, holds in it the weight of knowing what those 8 beings were before they became what they became, and the long tragedy of what was done to them, and the specific grief of watching even their corrupted forms end, without any of the ceremony that long existence probably deserves. But underneath the complexity there is something simpler and more immediate, which is the acknowledgement that it is done, and they are gone, and the road ahead of them has one fewer category of obstacle than it had before, and he turns forward and keeps walking because the road is not finished. Mordor itself responds to their approach in the way Mordor responds to things it perceives as threats, which is through the armies that Sauron has been building and directing for this age. The vast numbers of orcs and trolls and men corrupted to his service that represent the physical manifestation of his power in the world. The forces that in the original story required the entire military capacity of Gondor and Rohan to hold at bay long enough for the ring to reach Mount Doom. The Black Gate is open not to let them through, but to let the army through, the army coming outward to meet them. And what comes through the Black Gate is the full force of Mordor organized as a single, overwhelming military statement. The statement being that nothing approaches Sauron's fortress without paying a price that nothing can afford to pay. Aragorn stands with his sword drawn, and Gandalf raises his staff, and Legolas has an arrow on the string, and Gimli has his axe, and Frodo is standing slightly behind all of them with his hand on the hilt of Sting, which is glowing a blue so intense that it is casting visible light on the faces of the people around him. And Saitama is standing in front of all of them looking at the army coming through the gate with the expression of someone who has been asked to do a job and is doing the preliminary assessment of the job before beginning it. And the preliminary assessment is brief because the job, from his perspective, is the same job it always is, which is a lot of things that need to be punched, and a direction to punch toward, and a clear enough field to punch in. He cracks his knuckles, which is a sound so small and so completely out of scale with the situation that the army of Mordor, which is organized around the principle of overwhelming sound as part of the psychological architecture of its advance, does not even register it. And he steps forward off the edge of the ridge, are standing on, and drops to the plain below with the impact of a small natural disaster, and starts moving toward the army at a pace that begins as walking and transitions through running into something that is not quite either, but is instead the specific movement of a body that has stopped negotiating with the physics of the situation, and is simply going as fast as it has decided to go, which in this case is fast enough that the visual experience for anyone watching from the ridge is less the experience of seeing a person move through an army, and more the experience of seeing an army encounter something from the inside without any clear external cause. The orcs at the front of the advance meet him first, and their experience of this meeting is not an experience they are in a position to report back on, because the experience ends very quickly and completely, and the ones behind them who witness the ending of it encounter a problem that military organizations throughout the history of Middle-earth have encountered when their front line stops advancing for a reason the back of the formation cannot see, which is the problem of momentum without direction. The problem of an army that was built to push forward running into the sudden absence of the things it was pushing behind. The trolls are sent forward next because trolls are the Mordor military's answer to things that orcs cannot handle, the heavy force multipliers that exist specifically for situations where the standard advance has failed, and the trolls move through their own lines with the indiscriminate urgency of large things that have been pointed at a problem and told to go fix it, and they arrive at the location where the problem is happening, and the problem deals with them in the same way it dealt with the orcs, which is quickly and finally and without any particular adjustment of approach, because the difference between an orc and a troll from Saitama's perspective is the difference between a small thing and a slightly larger small thing, and the adjustment required to address a slightly larger small thing is so minimal that it does not register as an adjustment. It registers as the same action performed against a slightly different surface. Sauron is watching all of this through the eye, watching his army encounter something it cannot encounter successfully, watching the numbers diminish in a direction, and at a rate that no military calculation he has ever run has produced as an expected outcome. And what he is experiencing in this watching is something that his long existence has given him almost no preparation for, which is the specific and complete failure of every instrument of power he possesses to produce any effect on the thing producing the failure. He has faced opposition before. He has faced opposition that was stronger than expected before. He has faced reversal and defeat, and the loss of his body and the loss of the ring before. And all of those experiences, terrible as they were, existed within a framework he understood. The framework of power against power, of greater force meeting lesser force and prevailing, of the long, slow arithmetic of dominance that he has spent his entire existence practicing and refining. What he is watching through the eye is something outside that framework, something that is not stronger than his army in the way that a larger army is stronger than a smaller one, but is stronger in the categorical sense of being a different kind of thing entirely. And the different kind of thing is moving through his forces with the steady, uninterrupted, completely untroubled progress of whether moving through geography, not fighting the landscape but simply occupying it. And the landscape, which in this case is his army, has no more ability to stop the weather than geography has ever had. He turns the full force of the eye towards Saitama for the third time since the Shire, and for the third time the eye finds nothing. And this time the finding of nothing has a different quality from the previous 2 times, because the previous 2 times the nothing was a puzzle to be investigated, and now the nothing is a catastrophe already in motion. And the eye cannot reach the thing causing the catastrophe, and cannot stop it, and cannot redirect it, and cannot even fully see it. Can only watch the evidence of its passage through the things the eye can see, which is to say the army, which is resolving at a speed that Sauron's strategic mind, which is one of the most sophisticated strategic minds Middle-earth has ever contained, has already calculated is not a pace that leaves Barad-dûr with a great deal of time to prepare for whatever comes after the army is finished. On the ridge behind all of this, Frodo is watching, and his hand has relaxed from the hilt of Sting, and his face has the expression of someone watching something they expected to be terrible turn out to be something else entirely. Not something comfortable or something resolved or something that makes the long road that led here feel simple in retrospect, but something that is moving in the direction of finished in a way that the long road never let him fully imagine. And there are tears on his face that are not grief and are not joy, but are the specific release of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and is watching the weight begin to lift. Barad-dûr has stood for so long that its standing has become a feature of the world rather than a fact about a building, the way certain mountains become features of the world rather than facts about geology, the way their presence reorganizes the surrounding landscape around itself so completely that imagining the landscape without them requires an act of deliberate historical imagination rather than simple observation. It was built in the Second Age by a will so comprehensive and so patient that the building of it was not an act of construction in the ordinary sense, but an act of intention made physical. Every stone placed not just as a stone, but as a statement about the permanence of the power that placed it. Every tower rising not just as architecture, but as argument, the argument that this is here. That it has always been here in the sense that all things which are powerful enough feel as though they have always been here, that it will continue to be here past the memory of anyone who might want to imagine it otherwise. The Dark Tower is not just a fortress. It is a declaration rendered in stone and dark sorcery that Sauron exists, and that Sauron's existence is not a temporary condition, that the world is passing through on the way to something else but the permanent organizing fact of the world itself, the center around which everything else arranges its relationship to power. Sauron understands, in the hour after his army stops sending reports, that Barad-dûr is about to become a fact about a building again rather than a feature of the world, and the understanding is not arrived at through any failure of his intelligence or any gap in his information, because his intelligence is as comprehensive as it has ever been, and his information is perfectly accurate. It is the accuracy of the information that produces the understanding. The clarity of the picture his eye is assembling of what is moving across the plain of Gorgoroth, toward his fortress at a pace that his military models, which are calibrated against every military force that has ever existed in Middle-earth, return as not a meaningful input for calculation, because the variable the models require is time of arrival, and the thing approaching does not produce a time of arrival that falls within the range the models were built to process. He makes his last calculation in the way that Sauron makes everything, completely, methodically, without sentiment or panic, with the cold precision of a mind that has been trained by ages of experience to extract maximum strategic value from any situation regardless of how adverse the situation appears. To find the move that produces the best possible outcome, even when the best possible outcome is not a good outcome in any absolute sense, but is simply less catastrophic than the available alternatives. The calculation has several components, and he works through them in sequence, because sequential analysis is more reliable than simultaneous analysis when the situation is complex and the stakes are absolute. The first component is the assessment of the approaching threat, which the eye has now observed across 3 separate encounters, and which the observation has given him enough data to characterize with reasonable confidence, even in the absence of any spiritual signature, because physical evidence is still evidence, and the physical evidence is consistent and unambiguous. The thing approaching is not a military force, and is not a magical construct, and is not a divine intervention in any of the forms that divine interventions have taken in the history of Middle-earth, which is to say, it is not one of the valor descending in power and wrath to reshape the world, not a Maya expressing its full nature in physical form, not an artifact of concentrated ancient power being wielded by a hand capable of wielding it. It is a person. A single person, physically unremarkable by the standards of any race in Middle-earth, carrying no ring of power and no weapon of significance, and no heritage of bloodline that his comprehensive genealogical knowledge can attach to any meaningful power source. It is a person who is, by every metaphysical and spiritual measure his eye can apply, simply not there, and who is, by every physical measure the evidence of his army's encounter has provided, more than sufficient to remove any physical obstacle placed in its path regardless of the scale of that obstacle. The second component of the calculation is the assessment of his own resources, specifically the resources that have not yet been deployed, and that represent the remaining options available to him after the army has been accounted for. These resources are considerable in the absolute sense. Barad-dûr itself is a repository of dark power accumulated over ages, the remaining ring-wraith infrastructure that exists in forms less physical than the Nazgul, the concentrated will of his own presence which in its current semi-embodied state is a force that has broken armies and driven men to madness at close range. And they are insufficient in the relative sense, because the relative sense requires comparing them to what is coming. And what is coming does not participate in the comparison on any of the axes the comparison is designed to use. Dark power accumulated over ages is still dark power, still power in the framework that his eye and his will and his rings and his fortress all exist within, and that framework is exactly the framework that the approaching thing is outside of, and being outside the framework means that the framework's resources, regardless of their magnitude within the framework, are not resources for this problem. The third component is the most important and the most honest, and Sauron's willingness to perform it with genuine honesty rather than motivated reasoning is the thing that distinguishes his intelligence from lesser intelligences, which tend to generate the conclusions they prefer, and then find the supporting analysis afterward. The third component is the question of whether there is any action available to him that changes the outcome, and the answer the calculation produces, after examining every option his comprehensive knowledge of his own resources and capabilities can generate, is no. Not no in the sense of no good options remaining, which is a situation he has navigated before, but no in the sense of no options at all. No action that produces a different outcome rather than simply a different path to the same outcome. Because every action he can take is an action within the framework, and the framework is not the problem the thing crossing the plane is going to present to him when it arrives. He does something with this conclusion that is perhaps the most surprising thing Sauron has done in the entire Third Age, which is accept it. Accept it without additional analysis, and without the desperate generation of options that he has already concluded do not exist. Accept it with the specific quality of acceptance that is available only to a being old enough to have encountered genuine finality before, and to know the difference between a situation that feels final and is not, and a situation that is final and the feeling is accurate. He has been severed from his body before. He has existed as a dispersed will before, drifting without form across a world that had no place for him, rebuilding slowly from nothing over centuries, returning to physical presence through the patient accumulation of power from a world that eventually began always to generate the negative conditions his nature could feed on. He has survived the loss of everything before, and he knows the shape of that survival, and he knows, from the calculation he has just completed, that this time the shape is different, that the mechanism of dispersal and return that he has relied on twice already depends on the continued existence of something that this situation will remove, and that without that mechanism, the dispersal is not the beginning of a long return but simply the end. The One Ring is the problem. Not just strategically, not just in the sense of being the object whose destruction would end his reconstitution, but in the deeper sense of being the repository of the piece of himself he should never have put outside himself. The anchor of his power in a physical object that can be moved and sought and found by people whose motivation to find it and end it, he consistently underestimated, because his understanding of the kind of courage that produces that motivation was always theoretical rather than experiential, was always the understanding of a being who had never felt small and never felt afraid, and had therefore never needed to understand what drives beings who feel small and afraid to do things that beings of greater power routinely fail to do, because they are calculating the odds rather than deciding that the odds are not the deciding factor. He extends the eye toward the ring, which is somewhere on the approaching group, still present, still intact, still connected to him in the thread of that ancient relationship between maker and made, and he feels through that connection the specific and irreplaceable quality of the thing he put into it, the concentrated essence of his power and intention, and will give in permanent physical form. And what he does with this feeling is not pull the ring toward himself or push his will through it, or attempt any of the ring-based manipulations that have been his primary strategic instrument throughout the age, because the calculation has already told him that none of those actions change the outcome. What he does instead is something that requires a kind of description that is difficult to find in the available vocabulary, because it is the act of a being saying goodbye to the most essential piece of itself in the only way available, which is to acknowledge the connection, to feel it fully and honestly, and then to accept that the feeling is going to end. The eye turns toward Barad-dûr's gates as the gates begin, under the pressure of approach, to do something that Barad-dûr's gates have never done in the history of their construction, which is show structural compromise, because Saitama has arrived at the outer wall, and the outer wall is discovering, in the specific way that very solid and very ancient things discover things, that solidity and age are not the same as structural sufficiency against the force now being applied to them. That a wall built to withstand the armies of men and elves, and the assault of every military technology available in the Third Age, is a wall built to withstand things in the framework, and the framework has arrived at the wall's location, but the thing the wall needs to withstand has not, and the consequence of this is that the wall is resolving, section by section, in a way that looks from the eye's perspective less like a military assault and more like weather encountering geography. which is the same comparison that applied to the army on the plain, and that applies with equal accuracy here. Gandalf, standing on the ridge with the others, watches Barad-dûr's outer wall come down and feels in the world around him a trembling that is not physical, that does not come through the ground under his feet, but through the same perception that connects him to the fabric of Middle-earth's spiritual reality, the perception that has felt the world's changes across his long tenure as one of its stewards. And what he feels is the specific and unrepeatable sensation of a dark thing that has been woven into the world's fabric for so long that its removal changes the texture of the fabric itself, leaves behind it not a clean surface, but an absence with shape, the shape of what was there pressing itself into what remains the way an object pressed into soft material leaves an impression when it is removed. The trembling is the world adjusting to what is about to happen, pre-adjusting in the way that physical reality pre-adjusts to very large events, and Gandalf closes his eyes for a moment and simply feels it, because he has been waiting for this feeling for a very long time, and he wants to receive it honestly. Saitama reaches the inner sanctum of Barad-dûr, the place where Sauron's concentrated will exists in its current semi-embodied form, and what he finds there is not a body in the conventional sense, and not a monster in any of the forms that monsters take in Middle-earth, but a presence, dense and dark, and enormous in the specific way that very old and very committed evils are enormous. Enormous not in physical scale, but in the weight of everything it has done and caused and built across the ages it has existed. Enormous in the way that consequences accumulate around choices made long ago and compound across time, until the original choice is invisible beneath the mountain of everything it generated. He looks at this presence in the specific way he looks at everything he is about to deal with, which is directly and without drama, the look of someone assessing a task before performing it. And the assessment is brief because the assessment always arrives at the same conclusion, which is that this is a thing, and the thing needs to be addressed, and the addressing of it is going to happen right now. Sauron looks back at him through the eye, through the full force of a will that has shaped empires and corrupted kings and reached across ages to bend the world toward itself. And what the eye finds in Saitama is the same thing it has always found, the same nothing, the same complete absence of any quality the eye was built to assess. And for the last time the eye reaches out and finds nothing, and the reaching itself begins to change quality, to thin at the edges, to lose the coherence that a will needs to sustain its extended perception. Because what is happening in the room that contains the eye's source is happening at a speed, and with a completeness that does not give the will the time it needs to withdraw and consolidate and prepare for what is coming. The punch that Saitama throws in the inner sanctum of Barad-dûr is not a special punch. It is not named, and it is not charged, and it does not carry any additional intention or additional effort beyond the effort of a normal punch, because a normal punch has always been sufficient and is sufficient now. And what it meets in the concentrated dark will of Sauron is not resistance and not a counterforce, and not the vast ancient power asserting itself in whatever form concentrated wills assert themselves when they are threatened, but simply the will. Enormous and dark and present and then not, removed from the world with the same complete and total finality as a soap bubble touched by a finger, the complete absence of transition between existing and not existing that Saitama's punches have always produced in their targets, and that never stops being absolute regardless of the nature of the target, because the absoluteness is not a property of the punch's interaction with the target, but a property of the punch itself. A property of a force that has no ceiling meeting something that, however ancient and powerful within its own framework, is still something, and something has always and without exception lost to the specific nothing of a punch thrown by a man with no ceiling and nowhere else to be. The eye goes out. Not dimmed, not weakened, not driven back out, the way a light goes out when the source of the light ends, completely and instantly and permanently, And the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr, which has stood as a declaration of Sauron's existence since the Second Age, begins, in the absence of the will that held it together, to do what all things do when the intention that organized them ceases to be present, which is to follow gravity instead, to become what it would always have been without the dark intention sustaining it, which is a very large pile of very old stone in a very dark land, returning to the indifferent earth that it was built on top of without ever quite belonging to. The fall of Barad-dûr is heard across Middle-earth before it is understood, arriving in the perception of everyone sensitive enough to perceive it as a change in the quality of the world, rather than as a sound or a sight or any of the conventional sensory experiences through which events normally announce themselves. The elves feel it first, because the elves' connection to the spiritual fabric of Middle-earth is older and more refined than any other race's connection. And what they feel is something they do not have a word for in Quenya or Sindarin, despite those languages having words for almost everything that has ever happened in their long history. Because what they feel is the specific sensation of a weight being removed from the world that has been present for so long that the world had grown around it, had shaped itself in relationship to it, the way a river shapes itself around a boulder, and the removal of the boulder does not immediately give the river its natural shape, but leaves instead a swirling confusion where the natural shape used to be before the boulder arrived, a turbulence that will eventually resolve into something new, but that in the immediate moment of the boulder's removal is simply the experience of absence where presence was. The world not yet knowing what it is, without the thing that has been defining it for so long. Galadriel feels it in Lothlorien, and her hand goes to Nenya, the ring of water on her finger, and what she feels through Nenya is the severing of the connection that all the rings of power have maintained to the one ring since their forging, the thread that has run from every ring back to the master ring finally going slack and then going away. And she stands in her garden for a long moment in the specific stillness of someone receiving information that is simultaneously the best and the most complicated information they have ever received. The information of a threat's ending combined with the knowledge of what that ending means for everything that the threat's existence was, in a terrible and ironic way, sustaining. The three rings were made without Sauron's direct corruption, but they drew their power from the same source, and the source ending means the three ending also, and Galadriel has known this for a long time in the theoretical sense of knowing things that have not yet happened, and knowing it in the theoretical sense did not fully prepare her for knowing it in the experiential sense, for the feeling of Nenya going still on her finger, the warmth of it fading not dramatically but gently. The way daylight fades rather than the way a candle is blown out, and what she says into the stillness of her garden is not a word in any language but a sound, the specific sound of someone releasing a breath they have been holding for 3,000 years. In Mirkwood, Thranduil feels the darkness that has pooled in the southern reaches of his forest for generations begin to thin, and the thinning happens at a speed that does not correspond to any natural process of shadow retreating before light, which takes seasons and requires the sustained application of effort, but at a speed that suggests the shadow has lost its source rather than been driven back, has been cut off rather than pushed out. And what rushes into the space the shadow leaves is not immediately light in the warm sense, but in the neutral sense, the absence of darkness allowing the world's natural quality to reassert itself, the trees that have been bent toward shadow beginning, slowly, in the way trees do everything, to remember which direction the sun is. Aragorn is standing on the plain of Gorgoroth when the tower falls, standing with Gandalf and Legolas and Gimli and Frodo, and they watch the fall together, in the silence that enormous events produce in people who have been anticipating those events for a long time and discover in the moment of their arrival that anticipation did not prepare them for the actual experience of them. The tower falls in stages, because towers of that scale and that age fall in stages regardless of the nature of the force that initiates the falling, physics requiring time, even when the initiating event is nearly instantaneous. and each stage of the falling is a sound and a visual and a felt vibration through the ground beneath their feet. And the totality of the fall accumulates across these stages into something that is not just the falling of a building, but the physical expression of a conclusion. The world making material the fact that something is over, giving it weight and sound and dust, and the specific smell of very old stone meeting the air it was sealed away from for centuries. Saitama walks out of the dust of the fallen tower looking the same as when he walked in, cape slightly more disturbed, one additional scuff on the right boot, and he joins the group on the plain and looks at the settling dust with the mild, considered expression of someone reviewing completed work. And then he looks at Frodo and asks, in the direct and practical way he asks things, whether the ring should be dealt with now or whether there is a process that needs to happen first. Because he wants to be helpful about the order of operations, if there is a preferred order. Frodo looks at the ring on its chain around his neck, and then looks at Saitama, and then looks at Gandalf. And Gandalf looks at the ring, and at Frodo, and his expression moves through several things quickly before settling on the thing that has always been true about his relationship to the ring, which is that it is not his to decide, and has never been his to decide, and the decision of what happens to it belongs to the person who has carried it. And he says this quietly and clearly to Frodo. That the choice is Frodo's, that it has always been Frodo's, and that whatever Frodo chooses he will support it, which is the same thing he has always said and which now, in the context of the tower's dust still settling around them and Sauron's will no longer present anywhere in the world, carries a different weight than it carried before. Because the choice Frodo is now making is not the desperate choice of someone carrying an impossible burden toward an uncertain outcome, but the clear choice of someone who has arrived at the end of the road and has to decide what to do with the thing they carried there. Frodo takes the ring off its chain and holds it in his palm and looks at it, and the ring sits in his palm the way it has always sat, golden and quiet and present, and without Sauron's will in the world to animate its influence it is quieter than it has ever been in Frodo's experience of it. The voice that was never fully absent during the long carrying of it, reduced now to the faintest suggestion of a whisper, the residual pull of a habit that has lost its source. And Frodo feels in this quietness both the relief of the reduced pull and the specific sorrow of something that has been significant to him for so long, that its reduction, even its welcome reduction, is also a loss of a kind, the loss of the weight that has defined his experience of himself for the entirety of the journey that made him who he is. He hands it to Saitama. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just practically, the way you hand something to a person who has offered to deal with it, and says please, and Saitama takes it and looks at it for a moment with the neutral curiosity he brings to objects he has not encountered before. A small golden ring, plain, unornamented, warm in the hand in a way that gold does not become warm from body heat alone, and he closes his fist around it and the closing of his fist produces, from inside his grip, a sound that is very small and very final, and then he opens his hand and the dust that falls from it is not gold-colored but simply dust, the colorless neutral residue of something that was and is not, and the chain that held the ring falls from between his fingers and lands on the ground of Gorgoroth with the small sound of metal on stone, and that small sound is the last sound the one ring makes in the world. Gandalf watches this and does something he has not done in a very long time, which is close his eyes in the middle of an open field with other people present and simply be still for a moment. The stillness of someone who has arrived at the end of something enormous and is taking the time to feel the arrival properly before moving on to whatever the arrival means for what comes next. And in the stillness, his face has a quality that the people around him do not see often. Because the quality requires the removal of the role that his face normally carries, the quality of a being old enough to have forgotten what it feels like to be free of something, and now remembering, the specific and irreplaceable sensation of a burden so long carried that it had become invisible lifting away, and revealing by its absence how heavy it had always been. What Middle-earth becomes after the bald man leaves is a question that takes longer to answer than the events that precede it, because events have the clarity of happening or not happening, and what a world becomes is a process rather than an event, a long unfolding consequence of the moments that change the conditions under which the unfolding happens. The most immediate consequence is the most obvious one, which is that the darkness recedes, not in the dramatic all-at-once fashion of a story that wants to provide a clean visual resolution, but in the gradual, real, world-paced fashion of shadow leaving places where it has been for a very long time, day by day and season by season, the land responding to the changed conditions the way land always responds, slowly and completely, without any awareness of the narrative it is participating in. Mordor itself is the most dramatic example of this, because Mordor's darkness was the most deliberately sustained, the most thoroughly maintained by an active will that kept it hostile and volcanic and lightless as a statement of its owner's nature. And without that, the land reverts toward whatever it would have been without the centuries of dark intention applied to it, which is not immediately hospitable and will not be hospitable in any human lifetime, but is different, is soil rather than ash in some places, is quieter, is oriented toward the neutral indifference of geography rather than the active hostility of a dark lord's aesthetic preference. And the dwarves who eventually come to assess what Mordor's resources might yield to a world that is rebuilding find in it not the paradise that hopeful maps sometimes drew in the blank spaces, but not the wasteland that Sauron needed it to be either. Find instead a land in the process of becoming something. Which is the same thing every land is when it is being honest about itself. Aragorn is crowned because the long story that the Third Age was building toward for him reaches its conclusion on the schedule that story always intended, and the difference that Saitama's presence made to the arrival at that conclusion is not a difference in the outcome, but in the cost, which is to say the conclusion is the same conclusion but the road to it was different, was paid for differently, required different sacrifices and produced different scars, and delivered to the people who walked it a version of themselves that is shaped by different experiences than the version that walked the original road would have been shaped by. And different is not necessarily better, but is genuinely different. And the Aragorn who is crowned in the city of Minas Tirith carries in him a history that is not the history of the original Fellowship's road. Carries in it the specific and strange experience of a quest that was resolved faster and more completely than any quest in the history of Middle-earth has ever been resolved. And the strangeness of the resolution is something he will spend the rest of his long reign processing and making meaning from, in the way that people make meaning from things that happen to them that they did not expect and did not cause and could not have predicted. Frodo is the one who thinks about Saitama most often and most honestly after he leaves, which Saitama does in the characteristically undramatic way he does everything. One morning simply mentioning to Gandalf that he is going to go now, that he has a sense of how to get back to his own place from here, and that he should probably go back because there are presumably things there that need dealing with, and thanking everyone for the food and the company and the direction to Mordor which was helpful. And then walking away in the direction that he said he could feel pulling him, and not looking back, because Saitama is not a character who looks back when he walks away from things, not out of coldness, but out of the simple practical orientation of a person who is always moving toward rather than looking from, whose attention is organized around the next thing rather than the last thing, and the next thing is a walk of unknown length toward a dimensional boundary that he can feel the way he feels most things, which is faintly and without drama, and with the patient confidence of someone who has never had to worry about whether they will arrive, and has therefore developed no anxiety about the distance. Frodo thinks about him on the gray ship, later, sailing toward the undying lands in the company of the ring-bearers, and the ring-wearers and Gandalf, whose time in Middle-earth has concluded with the ending of the age he was sent to help with. And what he thinks is not about the power or the punching or the tower falling or the ring becoming dust in a yellow-gloved fist, though he thinks about all of those things too. What he thinks about most is the morning at Bag End, the very first morning, when a bald man sat at his table and ate 3 plates of food and talked about training and heroes, and the accidental navigation of dimensional boundaries, with the flat, honest, unperformed simplicity of someone who had no reason to present themselves as anything other than what they were. And what they were was a person who had decided to be helpful and was being helpful. And the simplicity of that decision and the simplicity of that motivation is something that Frodo, who has spent the entirety of his adult life inside narratives of enormous significance and enormous cost, finds in retrospect to be one of the most clarifying things he has ever encountered. The reminder that underneath all the significance and all the cost and all the long weight of the world's great stories, the thing that makes any of it worth anything is the same thing it has always been, which is someone deciding to show up and help, not because they were chosen and not because they were destined, and not because the stakes required it, and not because the alternative was unthinkable, but simply because showing up and helping was what they decided to be, once, a long time ago, before everything else happened, and they never found a good reason to stop. The gray ship carries him west, and Middle-earth continues becoming what it is going to be, which is a world that carries in it the memory of a morning in the Shire when something fell from the sky and ate 3 plates of food, and turned out to be, in the only sense that finally matters, exactly what it said it was, a hero, showing up, in the only way a hero knows how to show up, which is without ceremony and without expectation of recognition, and with the full, uncomplicated willingness to deal with whatever needs dealing with and then walk away and find the next thing that needs dealing with, because that is the job, and the job does not end, and ending it was never the point.